Hello everyone, welcome to another late night stroll through the stranger corners of history. If you found your way here, it's probably because your mind refuses to sleep. So let's give it something quietly absurd to chew on. Our first stop, ancient Greece, where democracy was born, but common sense occasionally wasn't invited to the party. Picture it, Athens at dusk. Olive oil lamps flicker. Merchants close their stalls, and somewhere near the agora, a man is being fined for bad breath. Yes, truly. Before we dive too deeply, a gentle nudge. If you enjoy stories that let you relax and learn at the same time, consider liking this video and subscribing to History at Bedtime. Also, feel free to leave a comment sharing your location and local time. We like to see history travel the globe alongside our viewers. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey. According to scattered references from classical writers, men were forbidden from speaking in public assemblies if their breath was, shall we say, less than divine. It wasn't just hygiene, it was politics. Imagine standing up in the world's first democracy, ready to deliver your big idea about naval reform, only to be interrupted by someone sniffing and saying, "By Zeus, sit down and chew a mint." Historians still debate whether this was ever formally codified or simply a social expectation. But even Aristotle commented on the importance of pleasing breath in civic life. Apparently, freedom of speech had an asterisk if you brushed first, and you might be thinking, surely that's as weird as it gets. But no, dear listener, humanity has never stopped drafting strange legislation. Let's drift ahead, quietly, across the centuries. The Mediterranean air cools. Time slips like silk. We arrive in ancient Egypt, where cats are sacred. The sun god rules, and one of the strangest laws imaginable took hold. If you harmed a cat, even by accident, you faced execution. Not a fine, not community service, death. The Egyptian cat law was absolute, and woe to the unfortunate person whose carriage rolled over the wrong feline tail. The Greek historian Herodotus even recorded a scene where, when a Roman soldier killed a cat accidentally, a crowd tore him apart before the authorities could intervene. It sounds extreme, but cats weren't just pets. They were protectors of the household, symbols of divine grace, and living embodiments of the goddess Bastet. Losing one was almost spiritual treason. And yet, beneath the surface, it makes sense. Ancient Egypt's survival depended on grain, and cats kept the rats at bay. To kill one was to invite famine. Behind every weird law, there's usually a reason, even if it's covered in fur. The night deepens, torches flicker, you hear the soft purring of the sacred cats and the whispers of scribes still debating whether Bastet's will was being served or defied. So far, we've learned you couldn't speak if you had bad breath, and you definitely couldn't harm a cat. Now, let's travel somewhere a little colder and a lot more chaotic. The year is 1471 in England, where lawmakers had a fondness for turning the petty into the punishable. In the city of York, there existed a law, entirely serious, that forbade the wearing of mischievous shoes. Yes, shoes, specifically the long, pointy ones fashionable among noblemen. which could extend up to 2 feet beyond the toes. These Krakows, named after the Polish city Krakow, were seen as symbols of vanity and moral decay. The longer your shoes, the more decadent you were assumed to be. So, in one of history's earliest fashion crackdowns, the council decreed that no man of lower station could wear toes longer than 2 inches, while nobility could extend to 6. It was class hierarchy by footwear. Historians still debate whether the law was enforced or simply mocked. After all, what's the penalty for excessive pointiness? Confiscation, shoe shortening. The mind wanders, but it does remind us of a timeless truth. Every era believes it's the most reasonable, while future generations can't stop laughing at it. Tonight, as the fire burns low and the stars above the Thames flicker like old lanterns, you can almost hear a constable somewhere whispering, "Sir, your shoes exceed the legal limit." If you're still awake, congratulations. You're now mentally traveling through civilizations that managed to turn absurdity into statute. Let's float eastward now into the meticulous world of feudal Japan, where honor ruled and even the smallest misstep could become a matter of legal consequence. Among the samurai, there was once a law, deeply earnest, forbidding anyone from touching another man's sword without permission. Fair enough, you might think, but this wasn't a please don't touch my things rule. It was a capital offense. If you laid a hand on a samurai's sword, you could legally be cut down on the spot. No trial, no paperwork. It wasn't about theft. It was about insult. The sword, the katana, was considered part of the warrior's soul. Touching it was like touching his spirit, or, to use a modern analogy, logging into someone's private diary and rewriting a few pages. Historians still debate whether this was more cultural code than official law, but records from the Tokugawa period make it clear samurai etiquette had the weight of law behind it. And here's your obscure tidbit. Some samurai were so protective of their swords that they'd rest them beside their futons at night, wrapped in silk, not for safety but companionship. There's something oddly tender in that, isn't there? The same steel that could end lives also needed to be tucked in. The candlelight flickers. We move again, now to France, the 19th century, a time of revolutions, romance, and regulation gone mad. In 1910, the city of Paris enacted a law forbidding women from wearing trousers unless they received official police permission. Yes, trousers, the same garments you probably have on right now. The original order was issued during the French Revolution to keep women from dressing like men. Later amendments allowed exceptions for women riding horses or bicycles. The law remained technically in effect for over a century, though no one enforced it. It was finally repealed in 2013, meaning that until just a decade ago, every Parisian woman in jeans was, legally speaking, a rebel. Historians still debate why it took so long. Bureaucratic inertia, misplaced pride, or perhaps France just enjoys its eccentricities, the way it enjoys its wine, aged, questionable, and best not rushed. The absurdities multiply when we consider that, at the same time, another French law required all men to carry at least one onion while traveling. to ward off illness and unwanted spirits. Imagine the smell of a train carriage in 1912 cigars, garlic, and bureaucracy. From there, the thread of absurdity winds its way to the Swiss Alps. In the village of Saas-Fee, there exists a modern law that declares it illegal to die within town limits. Why? Because the ground is too fruncin for burial. The mayor, in a stroke of practical lunacy, decreed that residents must take appropriate measures to avoid dying until spring. Of course, no one can enforce such a thing, but that's the point. Humanity's laws have always been equal parts control and comedy. The truth is, laws say more about our fears than our logic. We fear chaos, so we write rules. We fear time, so we regulate it. And sometimes we fear embarrassment, so we outlaw ugly shoes. The wind outside rustles faintly, like parchment turning. You begin to feel the rhythm of it all. Civilization, order, absurdity, repeat. We have only just begun our exploration. There are laws about fruit, about frogs, about funerals, and even about laughter itself. But for now, let your mind rest on the image of that frozen Swiss town, politely reminding you to stay alive until the snow melts. Somewhere beneath all the madness, there's comfort in knowing that even history, at its strangest, was written by people simply trying to make sense of their world the same way we do. The night deepens, the crackle of the fire softens, and the mind wanders further down this peculiar corridor of human order, where law meets lunacy. Let's turn now toward medieval Europe, where kings, clergymen, and councils spent centuries perfecting the art of overcomplicating the obvious. It was a world where everything needed divine justification, from how to kneel to how many ducks one could own. In the 13th century, the English town of Chester had a law forbidding Welshmen from entering the city after sunset. The idea, officials said, was to prevent late-night mischief, as though darkness transformed the Welsh into supernatural troublemakers. If caught, the law allowed for legal enforcement. In simpler terms, if you were Welsh and wandered in after dusk, you could legally be shot with an arrow. And, incredibly, the law technically remained on the books for hundreds of years. It wasn't formally repealed until the 1970s. Historians still debate whether it was ever enforced, or whether it lingered simply because no one thought to check the paperwork. Bureaucracy, it seems, can outlive both logic and empathy. But there's an obscure twist to this. Chester wasn't alone. In the same era, the city of Hereford had a rule that required Welsh visitors to beat a drum when entering town, just to announce their presence. One imagines medieval streets filled with the distant, sorrowful thump of nervous drummers crossing invisible borders. So much for merry England. Now, take a slow breath and imagine the air of another place. Another absurdity. We're in Venice, sometime in the 15th century, a city that floated between heaven and the sea, both brilliant and neurotic. Venetian lawmakers, terrified of chaos in their delicate lagoon republic, once issued a decree banning the use of excessively fragrant perfumes in public. The reasoning, overpowering sense, were thought to disturb the harmony of civic life. Imagine it, an elegant nobleman gliding down a canal, perfumed to perfection, only to be stopped by a city guard sniffing suspiciously like a human bloodhound. Your first major historical fact here. Venice, during its height, produced and exported over half the perfumes of Europe. It was a city obsessed with scent, for masking disease, seducing lovers, and asserting status. The government's attempt to limit perfume use was like modern Venice banning gondolas. Your second fact. Around the same time, the Venetian Senate issued another bizarre ordinance, forbidding gondoliers from singing too loudly at night because it was deemed a distraction to scholars. Historians still debate whether this was a matter of noise control or sheer pettiness. Either way, it paints a lovely image. A city glowing in moonlight, music echoing over the water, only to be silenced by a bureaucrat with a clipboard. Here's your obscure tidbit. One Venetian noblewoman, arrested for excessive perfume use, defended herself by claiming it was not fragrance, but piety, as her scent was an offering to God. It didn't work. She was fined, but points for creativity. Venice, glorious, delicate, self-conscious, reminds us that even in its beauty, it couldn't resist trying to regulate joy. Now, let's drift far away to the wide plains of Mongolia, under the endless sky of the 13th century, the empire of Genghis Khan. You might expect a ruler so fierce to govern through pure power, but in truth, Genghis was a man of structure. He created a complex legal code known as the Yasa, one of history's earliest written systems of law for a nomadic empire, and in it, some truly strange decrees. Your first major fact. It was illegal to wash clothes in running water during the summer. The reason, spirits were believed to dwell in rivers, and polluting them could anger these unseen forces, bringing drought. Your second fact, eating food with the left hand was forbidden. The left was associated with impurity, the right with honor. A pattern still found in many cultures today. Historians still debate whether the Yasa was a real written code or an evolving oral system, but all agree it blended practicality with superstition. And your obscure tidbit. Genghis Khan outlawed bathing during thunderstorms because it was said to offend the sky. One imagines his generals standing in the rain, armor slick with mud, muttering, "Sorry, sky." It's easy to laugh, but to his credit, these laws unified a vast, restless people under one vision. Strange, yes, but effective. The Mongol Empire endured by believing that even the heavens demanded respect. Perhaps every society, deep down, fears chaos so much that it begins regulating ghosts. The candle burns low. Let's move on. Now, we find ourselves in medieval Italy, where the line between piety and paranoia was as thin as a quill stroke. In the 14th century city of Bologna, a law was passed forbidding the sale of cheese deemed too strong for polite society. The offending variety was a local goat cheese, whose aroma, according to records, was so powerful that men swooned and women wept. Merchants caught selling it faced fines, or, in repeat cases, exile. The reasoning, the smell, disrupted civic harmony. Yes, apparently, the city feared being torn apart by fermented dairy. Historians still debate whether this was satire or actual statute, but the city archives confirm the existence of records of confiscated cheese. Bologna, ever proud, may have been too embarrassed to explain further. Your obscure tidbit. Around the same time, Siena issued a ban on cheese fights, impromptu food-throwing contests among young nobles. So perhaps Bologna's paranoia wasn't misplaced, but Italy had other, grander absurdities. In Florence, a 15th century law forbade women from wearing buttons below the waistline. Buttons, according to church authorities, were temptations disguised as tailoring. Imagine an entire generation of tailors fined for doing their jobs too well. Your first major fact. The church throughout Europe issued dozens of sumptuary laws, rules regulating what people could wear, eat, or even host at their weddings. The goal was to maintain class distinction. No merchant should look like a noble. No noble should look like a prince. Your second fact. In England, Queen Elizabeth I personally enforced a law dictating that only nobles of a certain rank could wear purple silk, because purple dye was expensive and symbolic of royalty. Ordinary citizens caught in violet were fined or imprisoned. Historians still debate whether these laws actually curbed vanity or simply redirected it. After all, humans are endlessly creative when told no. Here's your obscure tidbit. In Florence, a woman once defended her illegal buttons by arguing they were purely symbolic, a meditation on temptation, not an invitation. She still had to pay the fine, but the judge reportedly admired her reasoning. So it goes. Across time, the strangest laws have always shared a theme: fear disguised as morality, the fear of desire, of disorder, of laughter too loud, or colors too bright. As you listen, the world outside your window grows quiet. Somewhere in the dark, a stray law from centuries ago still lingers, forgotten but not gone. Ink on a brittle page, reminding us that humanity's greatest constant isn't progress or reason, it's absurdity. The candlelight dances across parchment, shadows flicker, and our journey through humankind's strangest laws drifts onward, slower now, softer, as though even history itself were beginning to yawn. Let's step quietly into the Middle Ages again, this time northward into Scotland, where superstition often wore a judge's robes. There, in the 1600s, a law decreed that if you were caught talking to yourself in public, particularly near livestock, you could be accused of witchcraft. The logic, if you can call it that, was simple. If the cows understood you, you were clearly consorting with the devil. One poor farmer from Aberdeenshire was arrested after being overheard whispering to his oxen. His defense? He was simply trying to motivate them. The court disagreed. Historians still debate how much of this law was actually enforced. It may have been more threat than practice, but the records show several cases where unusual speech led to interrogation. Your first major fact: between 1563 and 1736, under the Witchcraft Acts of Scotland and England, more than 2,500 people were executed on suspicion of witchcraft, and many were accused through minor infractions: owning a black cat, speaking alone, or having too many herbs in your kitchen. Your second fact: during these trials, swimming tests were common. The accused were thrown into water. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, but unfortunately dead. Here's your obscure tidbit. One Scottish town even banned whistling after dark, believing it summoned fairies and demons alike. So much for evening strolls. Imagine it, a quiet night, wind rustling through the highlands, and someone biting their tongue mid-tune, just in case the local sheriff heard. Now, let's drift from the misty hills to the sunlit absurdities of ancient Rome. Rome, that magnificent chaos of marble and madness, had laws for everything. Marriage, baths, even dinner parties. One, from the reign of Emperor Domitian, forbade serving more than one dish of mushrooms at a meal. Why? Because mushrooms were both a delicacy and a popular tool for assassination. The rule, they said, was for public safety. In practice, it was likely just to keep nobles from poisoning each other at banquets. Your first major fact: poison was such a concern in Rome that Emperor Claudius established an entire office called the Castillo de Venesis, the poison tribunal, to investigate suspicious deaths. Ironically, Claudius himself was later poisoned, allegedly by his wife Agrippina. Your second fact: under Emperor Augustus, laws were passed requiring citizens to marry and have children, with penalties for bachelors over a certain age. The idea was to strengthen Rome's population, but it mostly produced resentment and creative excuses. Historians still debate how strictly these moral laws were enforced, but ancient satire paints a clear picture. Hypocrisy was Rome's favorite sport. And here's your obscure tidbit. Emperor Nero once fined a senator not for breaking a law, but for snoring during a performance Nero himself was giving. The charge: disrespect to imperial art. You can almost picture it. Rome at dusk, marble glinting gold, and a senator being dragged out of the theatre for the crime of a mid-opera nap. As centuries turned, the obsession with regulating nonsense didn't fade. It just evolved. When Rome's legions fell silent, Europe's towns and cities inherited the parchment and quill, eager to scribble new absurdities of their own. So, let's move again to medieval France, where, in the town of Beauvais, an official law once declared that animals could be put on trial. Yes, animals, swine, dogs, and even insects. The reasoning was theological. If a pig killed a man, it had committed sin. Justice demanded judgment. So, courts held full trials, with prosecutors, witnesses, and even defense attorneys. Yes, really. In 1386, a sow in Falaise was tried for murdering a child. The pig was dressed in human clothes, chained, and sentenced to death by hanging. Your first major fact: these animal trials continued for centuries across Europe. The last known case was in 1750, when a group of rats was summoned to court for destroying grain stores in France. The rats, being rats, failed to appear. Your second fact: in 1522, beetles were excommunicated from a Swiss village for eating crops. A priest read a formal declaration to the field, warning them to leave under pain of divine wrath. The Beatles, predictably, ignored it. Historians still debate whether these laws were genuine attempts at justice or elaborate moral theatre. Perhaps they were both, a ritual to reassure a fearful people that order, however absurd, could be imposed upon chaos. And here's your obscure tidbit. When the rat trial ended in Switzerland, the court actually acknowledged that the rats had legitimate cause for absence, since cats in the area may travel unsafe. Legal empathy for rodents. The law, it seems, has always had a sense of humour, even when it didn't mean to. As the candle guttered low and the air grew still, you might begin to notice something strange about all these centuries of decrees and punishments. Beneath their absurdity lies something oddly comforting, a human need to name, to categorize, to pretend that the world makes sense, even if that means suing a pig or arresting a pair of shoes. You're still here, half awake, half adrift, floating through the centuries with a smirk. Let's keep wandering. Now we move to medieval Germany, a place so fond of regulation that even laughter had rules. In the city of Augsburg, the council once decreed that it was illegal to laugh in church unless the priest did first. It wasn't just about reverence. Laughter, they said, encouraged the devil. But there's irony baked in. Sermons often included humour to keep congregants awake during long masses. Priests would tell jokes, and the crowd was expected to laugh, but only after the holy man had smiled. Historians still debate the sincerity of this law, but the records mention fines for inappropriate merriment and unlicensed giggling. Imagine the tension. Rows of pious faces suppressing laughter until the priest's nod gave permission, like some divine comedy cue. Your obscure tidbit. In nearby Cologne, an ordnance band sneezing loudly during prayer, equating it to interrupting the Holy Spirit. One unlucky man recorded in the archives was fined for startling the faithful with his forceful expulsion. And so, the quiet worship of the Middle Ages was, at times, less about devotion and more about not accidentally laughing, coughing, or sneezing your way into debt. Now, let's cross the sea to China during the Ming Dynasty, where bureaucracy reached its purest and strangest form. There was a law stating that any government official who submitted a report using overly beautiful calligraphy would be punished for vanity. Reports, it seems, had to be legible, not poetic. Your first major fact: the Ming legal code, the De Ming Lu, contained over 460 statutes covering every imaginable act, from corruption to dress code violations. One decree required local officials to record rainfall in poetry during festivals, but not in official reports. The reasoning: too much beauty could distort truth. Your second fact: failing to bow the correct number of times before an imperial envoy was punishable by flogging, even for minor officials. Historians still debate how these rules were enforced across such a vast empire. But one thing is certain: the Ming state treated bureaucracy as sacred theatre. Every gesture, every word, every brushstroke had moral weight. Here's your obscure tidbit. One emperor issued a command that anyone reporting a solar eclipse must do so without emotional exaggeration. Apparently, there had been complaints that officials were writing panicked poetry instead of astronomy. You can almost see it. Scholars under candlelight, trembling as they try to make their handwriting plain enough not to offend heaven. Somewhere between fear and faith, between beauty and control, humanity has always written rules, not to organize the world, but to soothe itself, to make the unpredictable seem predictable, to turn chaos into paperwork. And as you lie there listening, history's absurdities begin to blend together. The laughter bands, the cheese laws, the whispering farmers, the perfumed Venetians. A great, gentle reminder that civilization, for all its marble and majesty, has always been just a fragile agreement among fools trying their best. The candle flame steadies again, throwing a soft halo of gold across old parchment and tired eyes. Tonight, we travel not just through centuries, but through human logic, that odd, elastic thing that can stretch itself into shapes only dreamers and lawmakers could love. Our next stop, medieval France, where absurdity met ceremony in a way only the French could perfect. In the mid-1400s, the city of Dijon, yes, the one later famous for mustard, passed a law declaring it illegal to serve wine to fish. Not sell, not drink, serve. It began, apparently, with a festival prank gone wrong. Someone, trying to be funny, poured leftover wine into a fountain containing live fish. The crowd laughed. The fish, reportedly, did not. A few floated upside down by morning, and the city council declared such behavior deeply unchristian. From that day forward, any person found inebriating aquatic creatures could face a fine of 5 sous, or, in modern terms, a slap on the wrist and eternal mockery. Historians still debate whether this was real or satirical, though the ordinance is mentioned in several 15th century municipal records. And here's the obscure tidbit. Dijon's mayor at the time later commissioned a fresco of Noah's Ark, where, if you look closely, one fish is clearly holding a tiny wine cup. It seems even bureaucracy has a sense of humor, centuries after the fact. Now, let's wander south to Spain, where the laws of the early Renaissance carried their own peculiar mix of chivalry and nonsense. In 1478, during the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, a local edict in Seville declared that it was illegal to duel while naked. The law's preamble helpfully noted that such conduct diminishes the dignity of honorable combat. Why this was necessary, no one quite knows. Historians suspect it was meant to stop mock duels, often staged by drunk students or nobles who wanted to embarrass rivals. But it's hard not to imagine the chaos that prompted such wording. Your first major fact: dueling laws became widespread across Europe by the 15th and 16th centuries, as monarchs tried to curb the lethal hobby of nobles settling insults with swords. In France, a decree by Henry IV in 1602 officially banned duels, though hundreds occurred anyway, each ending with a scandal, a song, or both. Your second fact: in England, the last known duel fought under formal honor code rules took place in 1852. Pistol at dawn, gentlemen seconds, and all. It ended rather anticlimactically. with one man shooting himself in the foot and declaring victory. Historians still debate whether the naked doling ban in Spain was ever enforced, but even if it wasn't, it remains a beautiful example of lawmakers staring into the abyss of absurdity and writing it down just in case. And your obscure tidbit, a surviving Spanish etiquette manual from the same period, advises that if one must duel, one should ensure the fight is conducted at dawn, after Mass, and preferably clothed. Sensible advice, really. By now, our journey through the ridiculous might be starting to feel oddly soothing. You see the pattern, don't you? Every time humans rise toward greatness, philosophy, science, art, someone drafts a law about trousers or cheese or fish intoxication. It's what keeps history balanced. Now, lean back. Let your thoughts drift. The fire's a little lower, the air softer. We're moving again across mountains and centuries into a world of powdered wigs, powdered faces, and powdered nonsense. The 18th century, enlightenment, rationality, civilization reborn in candlelight and coffee houses, and yet the laws just as deranged as ever. Let's begin in Switzerland, a nation known for neutrality, precision, and surprisingly, prohibitions against frogs. In the canton of Basel, during the late 1700s, it was illegal to make frogs sing after 10 p. The reasoning was noise control. Peasants were capturing frogs and keeping them in shallow water near taverns, hoping their croaks would amuse guests. The council decided enough was enough. Your first major fact: Switzerland's early cantonal governments were some of Europe's most locally democratic, which meant even the smallest complaint, like noisy frogs, could become actual law. Your second fact: these local codes formed the basis for what became the Swiss Federal Constitution in 1848, meaning the same system that outlawed frog concerts also inspired one of the most stable democracies on earth. Historians still debate whether the Basel frog law was more about animals or alcohol. Some say it was really aimed at tavern owners who drew loud nighttime crowds under the guise of amphibian entertainment. And here's your obscure tidbit. One letter to the council, preserved in the archives, complains, "My neighbour keeps a choir of frogs that croak like drunkards. Kindly silence them." Humanity, building nations, composing symphonies, and still filing frog noise complaints. Now, let's float eastward to Imperial Russia, a land of grandeur, cold, and spectacularly strange decrees. In 1714, Tsar Peter the Great passed a law requiring every nobleman to shave his beard or pay a special beard tax. Those who refused had to carry a copper token stamped with the words, "Beard tax paid." It was the Tsar's attempt to modernize Russia, to make it more European. Your first major fact: Peter introduced dozens of reforms inspired by Western Europe, from calendar changes to dress codes, all aimed at dragging Russia into modernity. The beard tax symbolized his fight against what he called barbarous custom. Your second fact: Peter even personally shaved the beards of resistant courtiers, reportedly laughing as he did so. It was said the clippings were kept in jars as souvenirs of enlightenment. Historians still debate how successful Peter's reforms were. He changed appearances, yes, but hearts and traditions proved harder to trim. Here's your obscure tidbit. The token for the beard tax, a real artifact, bore an image of a nose and mustache on one side and the words, "The beard is a superfluous burden," on the other. It's perhaps the most passive-aggressive coin ever minted. Imagine paying a fee simply to keep your face attached to history. Outside, snow drifts softly against wooden walls. The wind murmurs over Francine fields, and the absurdities of the past settle like frost on the mind. Every culture, every century has invented rules to control what cannot be controlled. Time, taste, laughter, even hair. It's almost poetic. In a ridiculous way, the great wheel of civilization turns, and somewhere, someone is drafting another law about frogs, fish, or fashion. You exhale, the candle wavers. The world is quieter now, both ours and theirs. And still, the ink of absurdity never runs dry. The room feels still now, the kind of silence that makes even the pages of history seem to whisper. You can almost hear the scratching of old quills, lawmakers hunched over candlelight, inventing rules for a world that rarely made sense in the first place. So, let's keep wandering softly into the next chapter of humanity's obsession with order. This time, we find ourselves in colonial America, a land where freedom was still an experiment and piety was the loudest voice in the room. In Plymouth Colony, around the 1630s, there was a law that banned kissing your spouse in public. Not strangers, not scandalous affairs, your spouse. The Puritans believed affection, even of the most innocent kind, was indecent if performed outdoors. A husband who greeted his wife with a kiss at the market could be fined or publicly shamed. Historians still debate how often this law was enforced. Some records suggest it was more of a moral warning than a criminal offense. But a few unlucky couples did find themselves scolded by town magistrates for unseemly displays. Your first major fact: many early American colonies had what were called blue laws, religious regulations that dictated everything from what you could wear to what you could say on Sundays. Connecticut's blue laws, written in the 1650s, forbade laughter during sermons, unnecessary walking, and even cooking hot food on the Sabbath. Your second fact: in some towns, church attendance wasn't optional. It was mandatory by law. Skipping Sunday service could result in fines, stocks, or public humiliation. And here's your obscure tidbit. One colonial court record describes a man fined for wearing his hat in an arrogant manner before a minister. Imagine a legal system so fragile it could be offended by posture. Still, these settlers weren't cruel. They were frightened of moral decay, of chaos, of the wilderness around them. So they built fences, not just around their farms, but around their souls. You can almost picture it, a quiet Sunday morning, the forest sighing in the distance, and two newlyweds standing inches apart, because love apparently needed a permit. Now, let's cross the ocean again to the misty streets of Victorian London. where morality and hypocrisy strolled hand in hand beneath the gas lamps. Here, laws weren't just written, they were embroidered into daily life. And one of the strangest of all was the Umbrella Regulation Act of 1861, which restricted the size of umbrellas carried by women in crowded areas. The reasoning: large parasols were considered a public hazard. Too many gentlemen had reportedly been poked in the eye by ladies of fashion. On Oxford Street, the newspapers called it the Great Parasol Panic. Your first major fact: Victorian London was notorious for its petty public order laws. Street performers, beggars, even shoe shiners could be fined for obstructing passageways. The obsession with tidiness was a reflection of the empire itself, massive, orderly, and terrified of disorder. Your second fact: Queen Victoria herself was once accused, quietly, of breaking one of her own public decency ordinances when she was photographed smiling too broadly during a royal procession. Smiling, you see, was not considered dignified. Historians still debate whether the umbrella law was strictly enforced or mostly mocked. But here's your obscure tidbit. One London police officer's diary from 1862 includes a note about confiscating a dangerously wide parasol, which he described as a weapon in disguise. So there it was, an empire that conquered half the world, trembling before the tip of a lady's umbrella. Every age, it seems, defines its sense of control through its smallest absurdities. The Egyptians feared cats, the Romans feared poison, the Victorians feared being accidentally touched by a parasol, and yet each one of them believed they were living in the most civilized time imaginable. The candle flickers lower now. The absurdity of history hums like a lullaby, strange and steady. You can almost hear the lawmakers whisper, "We meant well, we just didn't think it through." The year is 1889. The place, Japan, newly open to the world, reinventing itself with breathtaking speed. Samurai have given way to bureaucrats, and the Meiji government is busy modernizing every corner of life, even manners. And so, it happened that the Ministry of Public Morality issued a law stating that anyone who laughed too loudly in public could be fined for disrupting civic harmony. The law was rarely enforced, but its message was clear. Japan's new society was meant to be calm, efficient, and serious. Too much laughter, especially from the lower classes, was considered undignified. Historians still debate whether this law was ever officially codified or merely circulated as guidance, but numerous newspapers from the 1890s reference noise violations issued to groups of students or merchants for improper laughter. Your first major fact: during this era, Japan was racing to westernize after centuries of isolation. Public image mattered. Schools taught posture, facial expression, even how to walk properly in public. Laughter, it seemed, did not fit the modern mold. Your second fact: these regulations were part of a broader wave of Meiji reforms, which included dress codes for officials, haircut requirements for men, and rules banning old samurai top knots. The goal was transformation, but often at the expense of joy. And your obscure tidbit: one Meiji-era etiquette manual specifically warned women not to show their teeth when smiling. claiming it disturbed the aura of grace. A perfect smile, it said, was one that never quite appeared. Imagine an entire nation learning to laugh quietly behind their hands as trains roared through cities for the first time. Civilization, polished and polite, right down to the decibel. Now, let's move again to Italy in the early 20th century, where the fascist regime took a particularly strange interest in public behavior. Among the hundreds of decrees issued under Mussolini, one stands out for sheer absurdity. A law banning men from wearing excessively emotional facial expressions in public. The regime believed that stoicism reflected strength. Smiles were fine in moderation, but visible sadness or fear could be interpreted as anti-state sentiment. Your first major fact: fascist Italy tightly controlled art, fashion, and even facial hair. The official newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, published a guide advising citizens to present a calm and disciplined face in all public matters. Your second fact: schools even included facial discipline lessons, training students to maintain a proud, neutral expression at all times. It was, in essence, an attempt to outlaw vulnerability. Historians still debate whether this was truly enforced or largely symbolic, a way to turn emotional control into patriotism. But the diaries of citizens from the 1930s describe expression police, who scolded or mocked those who looked unhappy in public squares. Here's your obscure tidbit. In one rural town, a baker was reportedly fined for looking mournful while kneading dough. The official explanation: bread must not weep. It's almost poetic, isn't it? An empire terrified not of dissent, but of emotion. A reminder that power, at its strangest, is often afraid of the simplest human things: laughter, sadness, spontaneity. And as the fire grows faint, the absurdities of centuries swirl together. Laws against laughing, smiling, kissing, sneezing. A world forever terrified of its own humanity. You exhale, you imagine them all. These lawmakers and enforcers convinced they were saving civilization, when really they were just trying to keep the noise down. Perhaps every strange law in history was simply a bedtime story adults told themselves. If we control everything, maybe nothing bad will happen. But bad or not, it happened anyway. And still, we wrote it down. The fire has burned low now, the crackles softer, the shadows longer. We've traveled through centuries of rules and absurdities, laws against laughter, perfume, cheese, and emotion, and yet humanity's creativity in legal nonsense is far from exhausted. Let's move now to the golden deserts of ancient Egypt, where pharaohs ruled by divine right, and where one of the oldest known laws in history forbade fishing with nets on certain holy days. The reasoning: it offended the river gods. Your first major fact: the ancient Egyptians viewed the Nile as sacred, the lifeblood of creation. The river's annual flood was personified as the god Hapi, who fed and renewed the land. Fishing, while permitted, was carefully regulated. Temple priests determined when and where it was allowed, often timing it with lunar cycles. Your second fact: Herodotus himself wrote that Egyptian priests refused to eat certain kinds of fish entirely, considering them unclean, a cultural echo that would influence dietary customs centuries later. Historians still debate whether these laws were ecological preserving fish stocks or theological preserving divine dignity. Probably both. After all, nothing says ancient civilization like wrapping environmental policy in mysticism. Here's your obscure tidbit. In one tomb inscription, a fisherman boasts that he was faithful to the river, meaning he obeyed the fishing ban. Yet, next to his statue, archaeologists found a carving of him holding a suspiciously large net. Hypocrisy, it seems, was as eternal as the pyramids. But Egypt's legal eccentricities didn't end with fish. Some pharaohs, particularly during the later dynasties, were fond of issuing symbolic decrees meant to remind people who was boss. One such rule, issued under Psammaticus II, banned commoners from using blue dye in their clothing, a color reserved for royalty and temple priests. It was said that anyone wearing unauthorized blue would be stripped of their garment and fined a sack of barley. Imagine the ancient equivalent of a fashion police officer standing by the Nile, squinting suspiciously at tunics, and somewhere far away in time, you smile, realizing that humans have always found ways to turn self-expression into a misdemeanor. Now let's sail west, through centuries of salt and sea foam, to the island of Iceland around the year 1250. It was a society both poetic and harsh, where laws were recited aloud in great gatherings called Althing, and where logic occasionally fronts sea as solid as the glaciers. One law from this period declared it illegal to be too openly pagan. Not pagan itself, that was tolerated, but too pagan. The ambiguity was intentional. Christianity was spreading through the island, but the old gods still lingered in poems and private rituals, so lawmakers, unable to fully erase tradition, settled for a vague middle ground. Your first major fact: the Icelandic Gragas, meaning grey goose laws, were among the most detailed medieval codes in Europe, blending Norse custom with Christian morality. They covered everything from murder to sheep theft to proper bathing etiquette. Your second fact: after Iceland's conversion around 1000 AD, lawmakers allowed people to worship the old gods privately for nearly a century, a rare example of compromise in a time of fanaticism. Historians still debate whether open paganism meant actual sacrifices or merely public poetry praising Odin. Some scholars suspect it was used to silence poets whose verses were politically inconvenient. Your obscure tidbit: one saga describes a man accused of pagan display simply for carving runes into a drinking horn. His defense: the horn was thirsty. He was fined a single cow. Somewhere in that snowy land of volcanoes and sagas, you can almost hear the laughter, muffled by fur cloaks and the weight of winter. And so the pattern continues. Everywhere, in every century, laws bloom like frost, unique, intricate, beautiful, and completely ridiculous. As you listen, the candle flickers again. The air smells faintly of smoke and ink and time. You might start to realize that these laws, for all their absurdity, tell you something profound. They show us what people feared, fear of chaos, fear of laughter, fear of the gods, the weather, the neighbors, and perhaps the deepest fear of all, the fear of being free. The night deepens. The stars outside seem to pulse in rhythm with the story. Let's drift onward, softly, toward the lands of snow and silk and superstition. Now we find ourselves in Imperial China, deep in the Qing dynasty, an empire both delicate and immense, where laws could reach into the smallest corners of life. Among its many curious decrees, one stands out for sheer meticulousness: the law of names. It forbade the use of the emperor's name, not just in speech, but in writing, poetry, or even coincidence. If your name happened to share a single character with the emperor's, you were required to change it immediately or face punishment for disrespect. Your first major fact: this rule, called Bihui, Behi, dates back even further to the Han Dynasty. It forced scholars to rewrite ancient texts to avoid forbidden characters. Entire histories were edited to please the throne. Your second fact: this custom spread throughout East Asia to Korea, Vietnam, and Japan, shaping literature for centuries. In some cases, writers replaced forbidden words with blank spaces, creating eerie, silent gaps in their manuscripts. Historians still debate whether the practice was born of reverence or paranoia, probably both. The emperor's word was law, and his name apparently too sacred for mortal mouths. Your obscure tidbit: one poet during the Ming era was punished for accidentally writing a love poem containing a character from the emperor's name. His defense: it was written to honor beauty. The court replied, then honor silence. Imagine a world where even language itself could betray you. But absurdity isn't always born from fear. Sometimes it's born from paperwork. In the 18th century, the Qing government introduced a policy requiring each household to report every death to local officials, but not too quickly. If you reported a death within 24 hours, it was suspicious, too eager, wait too long, and it was neglect. The ideal window, the law stated, was between 3 and 5 days. Your first major fact: this was part of a broader bureaucratic system designed to prevent false claims for inheritance or tax evasion. But the law became so convoluted that officials often fined both the too hasty and the too late. Your second fact: the Qing administrative system was legendary for its complexity, an empire held together by ink, seals, and schedules. One French envoy in the 1700s described it as a clock that punishes those who tick too fast. Historians still debate whether the 3-day death rule was applied universally or just in certain provinces, but records show families being reprimanded for disturbing bureaucratic rhythm. Your obscure tidbit: in one recorded case, a widow waited exactly 3 days to report her husband's death, only for the magistrate to accuse her of suspicious punctuality. She sighed, if the dead must keep appointments, let him rise to sign the form. Somewhere, an ancient scribe surely smiled, and as the ink dries on another century's laws, we pause again. The absurd, the tragic, and the oddly poetic blur together like shadows on a wall. You breathe in, you feel the weight of time soften. The world, it seems, has always tried to control what cannot be controlled. Laughter, love, language, death itself. And maybe that's the point. Maybe these strange laws weren't just about control. Maybe they were humanity's way of whispering into the dark. We are trying to make sense, trying to stay safe, trying to keep the world from falling apart, even if it means fining a widow for punctuality. The candlelight has dimmed now, but your mind drifts ever further, past parchment and empire, into the quieter absurdities that only civilization, at its most confident, could invent. Let's wander into 19th century France, where sophistication met silliness in ways only the French could perfect. In 1867, the city of Paris passed a law requiring all cab horses to wear hats. Yes, hats. Straw ones in summer, felt ones in winter. The idea was not fashion, though it certainly became that, but hygiene. The horses, who worked long days under the sun, were said to faint in the heat, causing traffic jams and chaos. Officials reasoned that a hat, or protective bonnet as they called it, would prevent equinological fatigue. Your first major fact: by the mid-19th century, Paris had more than 70,000 horses working daily, pulling omnibuses, delivery carts, and cabs. The city's dependence on horsepower was absolute. In fact, the daily manure output in Paris at the time was estimated at 1,200 tons. Your second fact: Napoleon III's government prided itself on rational order, which meant everything, including animals, had to operate like clockwork. So when horses collapsed from exhaustion, the solution wasn't rest, it was hats. Historians still debate whether this regulation was genuinely enforced or simply proposed by an overzealous bureaucrat. The official records include several mentions of unsuitable headgear, suggesting at least a few poor souls were fined for non-compliance. And here's your obscure tidbit. The Gazette de Paris reported that one carriage driver protested the rule by dressing his horse in a woman's bonnet, complete with ribbons and lace. He was fined twice, once for mockery, once for creativity. You can almost picture it, a boulevard lined with elegant Parisians, horses wearing hats, and somewhere a poet thinking, yes, this is civilization. Now, the air changes again. The sound of the fire becomes distant. You drift to medieval Japan, where laws could be both deeply poetic and deeply ridiculous. During the Kamakura period, around the 13th century, samurai were forbidden by law to strike a man in anger after sunset. The reasoning: nighttime violence dishonored the warrior spirit. If a samurai truly had a grievance, he should act in daylight, in full view of the gods and witnesses. Your first major fact: samurai law. The book Shahato, or Rules for the Military Houses, established an early form of ethical code that emphasized composure, loyalty, and restraint. Yet beneath the surface, its purpose was control, to prevent feuding clans from turning every insult into bloodshed. Your second fact: dueling after sunset was considered an act of cowardice, punishable by loss of rank. If a samurai wished to challenge another, he had to announce it publicly and wait until dawn. Historians still debate whether this rule truly discouraged violence or simply postponed it until sunrise. Here's your obscure tidbit. 1/14th century samurai diary tells of a warrior who, desperate for revenge, waited until midnight, built a small fire, and declared, "This counts as dawn." The magistrate fined him for philosophical dishonesty. So much for poetic loopholes. Even in the disciplined world of the samurai, the law could bend toward the absurd, proof, perhaps, that even honor can't resist irony. The fire hums softly again, the light tracing golden paths on the floor, and somewhere between the horse hats of Paris and the moonlit duels of Japan, you begin to sense a pattern. Every society invents absurd laws, not to limit people, but to perform civilization. The rules are theater. They tell us not just what we can't do, but who we think we are. You lean back, the chair creaks, the story somehow feels as familiar as it does strange. We have been ridiculous for a very long time. The centuries turn once more, and now we find ourselves in Renaissance Italy, where beauty, vanity, and legislation often mingled like wine and gossip. In 1545, the city of Florence passed an ordinance that made it illegal for women to appear in public wearing more than 2 rings per hand. The reasoning: moral moderation. Apparently, the church and civic officials feared that excessive jewelry encouraged sin, or worse, envy among the lower classes. The penalty for over-accessorizing, confiscation, and a public lecture on humility. Your first major fact: such rules were part of a broader category called sumptuary laws, designed to regulate clothing, feasts, and adornments based on class and wealth. Florence, Venice, and Milan all had versions of them, each trying to preserve social harmony. Your second fact: these laws had a paradoxical effect. Instead of curbing vanity, they made luxury even more desirable. Noble families began commissioning secret jewelry pieces or hidden gems stitched inside gloves and sleeves. Historians still debate whether these laws were moral or economic, since many doubled as protectionist policies to keep the textile guilds in control. Your obscure tidbit: one Florentine noblewoman was fined for illegal opulence after attending church wearing a gown embroidered with gold thread. Her defense: it was for the glory of God. The judge replied, "Then let God pay the fine." Ah, Florence, always dramatic, always beautiful, always finding a way to turn faith into fashion. Now, let's travel north to Denmark, land of Vikings, philosophers, and quietly strange regulations. In the 18th century, Danish law forbade naming a pig. Napoleon. The rule came centuries later, after Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to fame, but it endured well beyond his fall. The Danish crown, eager to avoid diplomatic offense, made it illegal to give livestock the names of foreign monarchs. Your first major fact: this wasn't unique to Denmark. Similar laws appeared across Europe, especially in countries wary of political satire. In Prussia, insulting foreign leaders was punishable even in jest. A farmer naming his goat Bismarck could, theoretically, be tried for defamation. Your second fact: Denmark's Napoleon pig law technically remained active until the early 2000s, when it was quietly repealed during a legal modernization effort. For over 2 centuries, the Danish Penal Code protected the honor of an emperor long dead. Historians still debate whether anyone was ever charged under it, but one Danish historian dryly noted, "It reveals a country more afraid of puns than invasions." Your obscure tidbit of folktale emerged of a clever farmer who named his pig l'Empereur instead, claiming it was Latin for bacon. The officials, not fluent in irony, let him go. The absurdities roll on, soft and rhythmic as the ocean. You start to sense a strange comfort in it, the idea that humanity's nonsense never really ends. It just changes clothes. The fire has burned to its heart now, deep amber and quiet. You close your eyes for a moment and listen to the hum of time itself. Somewhere, in every century, someone is breaking a ridiculous law, and somewhere else, another person is writing a new one. The fire is barely a whisper now, a gentle glow, fading slow as time itself. You can almost hear the soft crackle of centuries curling at the edges. The world beyond your window feels still, as though history has paused just long enough for you to wander one step further into its strangest corners. Tonight, the journey takes us to Victorian England, the age of steam and strictness, an empire obsessed with manners, appearances, and the faint terror of being embarrassed in public. Among the oddest laws passed in that prim and proper age was one from 1872 that made it illegal to operate a carriage, a cow, or a steam engine while intoxicated. Yes, a cow. The official wording of the Licensing Act of 1872 stated, "Any person found drunk in charge of a carriage, horse, cattle, or steam engine may be apprehended and fined." Apparently, a few too many farmers had been caught leading their cows home after a long night at the pub, swaying left when the cow swayed right. Your first major fact: this law, astonishingly, still exists in a modernized form in Britain today. While it's mostly forgotten, it technically means one can still be arrested for being drunk in charge of livestock. Your second fact: the same law also made it illegal to be drunk on licensed premises. In other words, you could legally drink in a pub as long as you didn't get too drunk. Imagine the circular logic of that one. Historians still debate how often the drunk cow clause was enforced. Some suspect it was rarely used. Others think it served mainly as a moral warning to the countryside's merrier souls. And here's your obscure tidbit. A magistrate in Yorkshire once reduced a man's fine because he argued convincingly that the cow was leading him, not the other way around. England, where law and absurdity walked arm in arm right into the fog. From the damp lanes of London, we drift now to the heat and laughter of ancient Greece, where philosophy ruled, but common sense occasionally took a vacation. In the city of Athens, it was once illegal for actors to impersonate philosophers on stage. You might think this was out of respect. It wasn't. It was because the actors were too good at it. Plato, the great thinker himself, complained that actors mocked philosophers as frauds and fools, lounging in their robes, babbling nonsense about forms and truth. Audiences loved it. The philosophers, however, did not. So the Athenian assembly banned false portrayal of learned men for fear it would diminish intellectual authority. Your first major fact: Athens' drama festivals, like the Dionysia, were the beating heart of Greek culture. Plays were political, satirical, and often dangerous. Aristophanes' comedies mocked everyone from generals to gods. Your second fact: though freedom of speech was celebrated, slander laws were strict. Even playwrights could be fined or exiled for insulting public figures too directly. A kind of ancient cancel culture, but with better sandals. Historians still debate whether the philosopher impersonation ban was enforced or simply symbolic. But one comic poet, Eupolis, is said to have disappeared mysteriously after mocking a powerful politician named Alcibiades. Whether by law or by sword, the joke had gone too far. Your obscure tidbit: one Athenian actor found a loophole by performing as a generic wise man who happened to resemble Socrates but was called Socrates. He was booed repeatedly. Somewhere between laughter and law, Greece proved what we already knew: that no civilization, no matter how enlightened, is immune to taking itself too seriously. You sigh, it's a soft sound, the kind that melts into candlelight. Even in their most absurd rules, you begin to sense something deeply human. Each law, however ridiculous, was born from the same fragile desire to make the world behave, to give shape to chaos, to write a little order into the dark. The night outside has gone completely still. Only the steady breath of the fire remains. And so we turn one more page, gently, into another century's silliness. Let's go to Finland, the 19th century, when the land was still under Russian rule and the northern winters felt like eternity. There was once a local ordinance that forbade singing loudly while drunk in the streets after 9 p.m. The logic: loud singing attracted wolves. Your first major fact: wolves were a serious problem in rural Finland well into the 1800s, when small towns often lay near dense forests. Villages posted watchmen at night to guard against attacks, and drunken singing, it turns out, did indeed draw unwanted attention. Your second fact: the law was later rephrased to penalize nocturnal disturbance by melody, which is surely one of the greatest legal phrases ever written. Historians still debate whether wolves were the true reason for the rule, or whether it was simply a polite way to keep villagers quiet. But the fear was real enough, and the penalty for ignoring it included a night in the stocks and public embarrassment. Your obscure tidbit: one folk song written in secret defiance became popular among fishermen. Its chorus translates roughly to: if the wolves come, let them sing too. They can't carry a tune. Finland, proving even in silence, there's humor hiding behind frost. Now let's travel south to India, around the 15th century, a land of sultans, scholars, and a rich tapestry of rules that often mixed the divine with the practical. One medieval court record mentions a curious Mughal regulation. It was forbidden for royal elephants to walk near astrologers. The reasoning: elephants disrupted the stars. Astrologers claimed the massive beasts unbalanced the heavens with their presence. disturbing the delicate cosmic energy used for divination. And since emperors valued their fortunes, they simply banned pachyderms from celestial neighborhoods. Your first major fact: astrology held immense sway in India's royal courts. Important state events, coronations, weddings, even wars, were often timed according to the stars. So, logically or not, the astrologers held the elephants at bay. Your second fact: elephants were status symbols of power, and each emperor maintained detailed registries, names, lineages, training logs, almost like noble family trees for animals. Historians still debate whether the astrologer elephant law was a royal whim or an enduring policy, but several Mughal administrative texts mention restricted zones of cosmic balance around observatories and temples. Your obscure tidbit: one rebellious astrologer, offended by the ban, reportedly trained a parrot to mimic the sound of an elephant's trumpet just to prove his cosmic resilience. The parrot, naturally, became famous, the astrologer less so, and so it goes, from cows in pubs to elephants in starfields, every culture finding its own peculiar logic in the dance between chaos and control. As the night deepens, these strange laws begin to sound less like rules and more like lullabies, soft, repetitive, and oddly reassuring. Each one whispers a small truth. We are all just trying to draw lines in the dark. Sometimes they make sense, sometimes they're ridiculous, and sometimes they're both. The fire is low now. Its glow trembles like a fading heartbeat, but the story is not yet done. The fire sighs, collapsing softly into embers, the air thick with the perfume of smoke and old memory. You're still here, half dreaming, half wandering through centuries of nonsense that somehow made perfect sense to the people who wrote it down. Let's travel now to France, sometime in the late 1600s, when powdered wigs were tall, manners taller, and logic, well, on vacation. In the royal court of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, there was a strict law against sitting in the king's presence without permission. That might sound normal. He was, after all, the living embodiment of divine order. But here's the twist: it also applied to chairs. When Louis entered a room, all chairs except his had to be removed. No one could sit, not even his mistresses, ministers, or mother, unless he graciously granted a sitting privilege. Your first major fact: the right to sit, le droit de s'asseoir, was an actual hereditary honor granted to a small number of noblewomen, often wives of dukes. They could bring a folding stool called a tabouret to court and rest while others stood. Your second fact: this privilege became so sought after that families spent fortunes bribing officials to secure it. Some nobles complained that it led to literal chair corruption. Historians still debate whether Louis himself found it amusing or simply practical. After all, what better way to remind everyone who was in charge than to make standing an act of worship? Your obscure tidbit: one lady of the court denied the right to sit, reportedly fainted during a long audience. The king's physician revived her, only to whisper, "Madame, it is fatigue of the legs, not of the soul." You can almost picture it, an entire court standing stiff as marble while one man reclined, golden slippers glinting in the candlelight. Civilization sometimes is just a game of very fancy musical chairs. From gold-plated Versailles, let's step into the cold discipline of Prussia, 18th century, a place where everything had a rule, including rules about rules. Under Frederick the Great, a law was introduced that made it illegal for soldiers to whistle while marching. The reason? It invites disorder of the mind. The Prussian army was the pride of Europe, a mechanical marvel of precision. Whistling, officials believed, could disrupt rhythm, distract focus, or, horror of horrors, imply cheerfulness. Your first major fact. Frederick's military reforms were legendary for their rigidity. Uniforms had to be buttoned to the last clasp, gait measured by inches, and facial hair trimmed to regulation length. Even the height of a soldier's hat plume was standardized. Your second fact. This obsession with order inspired armies across Europe, from Russia to Britain, shaping the foundation of modern military discipline. The cost, humanity. Historians still debate whether the no whistling decree was symbolic or sincerely enforced, but several letters from officers mention soldiers punished for unseemly melody. Your obscure tidbit. One young drummer boy was caught humming while polishing his boots. When asked why, he replied, "Sir, even boots need marching songs." The officer let him go, reportedly saying, "If the boots rebel, I shall surrender." And so it was, in a land where silence marched in perfect step. Strange, isn't it? How easily laws become reflections of fear, not of crime, but of chaos. The fear that laughter, or music, or a misplaced chair might unravel the whole fragile illusion of control. You exhale, softly. The night deepens. The absurdities pile higher, and yet begin to feel familiar, even comforting. Maybe you think every age invents nonsense laws to distract itself from bigger, scarier truths, the ones no decree can touch. And so we walk onward through the centuries into the gentle absurdities of the modern world. The year is 1902, and we're in Paris again, though it's not the royal court this time, but the age of bicycles, bohemians, and beautiful nonsense. A new law has just been passed. It is illegal to kiss on railway platforms. The reason? To prevent delays. Apparently, the lovers of Paris were so passionate in their farewells that trains routinely left late. Policemen were stationed at stations to gently separate couples as whistles blew. Your first major fact. The Loi sur les embrassades publique picking law was officially passed in 1900 and enforced across French railways for nearly half a century. It wasn't repealed until the 1970s. Your second fact. Similar rules appeared in other countries. In Britain, railway inspectors complained of romantic obstruction, and in the United States, several stations posted signs reading "No Kissing Zone." Historians still debate whether the French law was seriously enforced or mostly symbolic. But love, as always, ignored bureaucracy. Police reports mention countless verbal warnings issued to couples caught mid-embrace. Your obscure tidbit. One Parisian paper in 1905 ran a headline reading, "Delay at Gare de Lyon Train waits for love. The article ended simply. They kissed. He missed it. She cried. Order restored. Somehow, humanity never quite learns to be punctual about passion. Now, let's drift across the sea to New York City. 1916. The Jazz Age stirring, the skyline rising. Amid the noise and innovation, a curious ordinance appeared. It was illegal to open an umbrella indoors in public buildings. The logic was part superstition, part safety. Collapsing umbrellas in crowded lobbies caused accidents, and some believed bad luck. But officials worded the rule so vaguely that it applied everywhere from hotels to train stations. Your first major fact: early umbrellas were made of wood, metal, and oilcloth, heavy, sharp, and dangerous in tight quarters. In 1908 alone, New York hospitals recorded thousands of eye injuries attributed to indoor umbrella mishandling. Your second fact: superstition amplified the fear. Opening an umbrella indoors was said to invite misfortune, a belief dating back to ancient Egypt, where parasols symbolized divine sunlight, an offense to unfurl one without the sky above. Historians still debate whether the city's law was ever rigorously applied or simply encouraged by wary building owners. Your obscure tidbit: one socialite in 1922 staged a protest tea party called the Open Umbrella Society. Dozens attended, opening umbrellas inside a Fifth Avenue ballroom to prove fate wrong. A chandelier promptly fell. Coincidence? Perhaps, but New Yorkers never forgot. Now the night hums with quiet irony, the kind that tastes faintly of rain and candle wax. You realize that these laws, however ridiculous, all share a strange beauty. They are small love letters to fear, written by people who simply wanted the world to behave, even for a moment, to make trains run on time, to keep chairs in their place, to silence whistling soldiers and steady trembling hearts at midnight stations. You take a slow breath. The absurdity feels soothing now, like an ancient lullaby sung by bureaucracy itself. Because if humans can write laws about frogs, perfume, and hats for horses, then maybe, just maybe, the universe isn't as cold or random as it sometimes feels. It's just human. The night outside feels heavy now, ancient, infinite. The fire's low heart glows faintly gold, a patient ember of the world's long, strange memory. The air hums with the ghosts of absurdity, Venetian perfume finds, Japanese dual curfews, drunken cows, and sighing soldiers. And yet, the deeper we travel, the clearer it becomes. The weirder the law, the more it reveals the heartbeat of its time. Every rule tells a story, not of control, but of longing. Now, let's drift toward ancient Rome one last time, where the empire's laws, so admired for their order, could also trip over their own sandals. One of the strangest decrees of all came from Emperor Caligula, who issued an official edict declaring that no one was allowed to look at the full moon while standing on one foot. The reasoning: Caligula claimed it angered the gods, and possibly him. Your first major fact: Caligula's reign, the 37 to 41 CE, was infamous for bizarre decrees. He once declared his horse a priest and allegedly ordered soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of war after failing to invade Britain. Whether the Moon Law truly existed in formal writing is debated, but ancient sources like Suetonius record orders against indecorous posture during celestial observation. Your second fact: Roman law was a living organism. It evolved daily, shaped by decrees called edicta, issued by emperors or magistrates. Many were symbolic, moral performances, reminders of who controlled even the stars. Historians still debate whether Caligula's rule was madness or theatre, perhaps both. The line between divine comedy and imperial decree was often blurred in the marble corridors of Rome. Your obscure tidbit: one Roman senator reportedly tested the rule by standing on one foot during a lunar festival, muttering, "If I fall, may Jupiter sue me." He was quietly reassigned to a distant province. So there you have it, the empire that conquered the world and still found time to outlaw awkward stargazing. From Rome's marble absurdities, let's drift north again to Sweden in the 17th century, a land of cold light, Lutheran solemnity, and the occasional legislative surprise. Among its odder statutes was the law of yawning in church. If you were caught yawning, stretching, or dancing during a sermon, you could be fined, or in repeat cases, forced to stand during the next service holding a wooden placard that read, "The Lord is patient, though I was not." Your first major fact: Sweden's Lutheran Church dominated daily life in the 1600s. Attendance was mandatory, and clergy reported absentees to local officials. Yawning laws were meant to restore reverence during long services that could last up to 4 hours. Your second fact: the fine for public slothfulness ranged from a few silver coins to a day of public shame. Even the nobility weren't exempt. Records mention a baron's son fined for excessive drowsiness during sermon. Historians still debate whether anyone truly paid these fines, but several churches preserved the wooden yawning boards engraved with sleepy cherubs as gentle reminders of divine wakefulness. Your obscure tidbit: one rural preacher, tired of scolding his dancing flock, installed a small boy in the rafters with a long stick to gently tap heads mid-sermon. The congregation called him the Angel of Alertness. And so, beneath the sacred arches, faith became a battle not between good and evil, but between eyelids and eternity. Strange how each civilization seems to arrive at the same idea, that reverence must be legislated, that quiet must be forced, that obedience can be carved into law like commandments on stone. And yet, every one of these laws has crumbled, forgotten by time, laughed into dust. You breathe softly. The absurdity feels almost holy now. Proof that humanity's foolishness, like its hope, never quite dies. There's something deeply tender about that. And so, with the faint crackle of the fire beside us, we turn to our final wanderings through the modern world's most recent, but no less ridiculous, rules. The year is 2025. The world hums with satellites, algorithms, and infinite screens, and yet Absurdity endures as alive as it was in Rome or Florence or the fields of Iceland. Consider Singapore, where a law passed in 1992 makes it illegal to chew gum in public, not spit it, chew it. The reasoning, cleanliness. Your first major fact. The ban came after officials grew frustrated with vandalism caused by gum stuck to public trains and locks. So they did what all great civilizations eventually do. They outlawed inconvenience. Your second fact. Despite criticism from abroad, the law worked. Litter dropped dramatically, and Singapore's spotless reputation became legend. Yet the government still enforces it. Importing, selling, or even possessing large quantities of gum can result in fines. Historians still debate whether the rule is visionary or absurd, perhaps both. And your obscure tidbit. Singapore briefly relaxed the law for therapeutic gum prescribed by doctors. Bureaucracy meets bubble mint. Or take Venice, our old friend of fragile beauty, which in 2019 introduced a law banning sitting or eating on certain public steps. The reasoning: tourists, too many, too loud, too messy. Violators were fined up to €500 for dignified loitering. It's hard not to imagine the city drowning under centuries of waves and selfies, simply whispering, "Please, behave." And then there's Japan, ever elegant, ever peculiar. In 2008, it passed the Metabo Law, requiring companies and local governments to measure the waistlines of citizens aged 40 to 74. If an employee's waist exceeded government guidelines, the company could face penalties. The goal was health. The outcome: national anxiety about belts. Historians of the future will likely puzzle over this, the same way we chuckle at Venetian perfume bans and Finnish singing curfews. Each law, absurd in its own way, carries the same fragile wish: to protect, to perfect, to make sense of living in a world that never quite behaves. And so, here we are, 20 centuries later, still writing rules about laughter, love, posture, and gum. Still convinced that if we just legislate the little things, the big ones might take care of themselves. The fire's almost gone now, just a faint red heart of heat, glowing like the last breath of an idea. You can almost see the lawmakers of history sitting around it, arguing softly. No laughter at funerals, no hats for horses, no duels after dark. And somewhere, a tired scribe nodding off mid-sentence, dipping his quill one last time into the ink of eternity. Now, take a slow breath. The story is ending, and the laws of nonsense are fading back into the shadows where they belong. Picture them dissolving like smoke, scrolls turning to dust, tablets crumbling, whispers drifting into silence. The frog bans, the cheese fines, the perfume patrols, the laws against laughter and love, all gone. What's left is the strange comfort that humans have always been the same, dreaming, fearing, trying. We wrote laws not because we were wise, but because we were scared. Scared of laughter too loud, of death too close, of life too unpredictable. And in trying to tame the world, we created something unintentionally beautiful, a museum of our own foolishness. So, as you lie there now, eyes heavy, mind floating through time. Remember, the world has always been ridiculous, and that, perhaps, is what makes it worth living in. The fire fades to a whisper, the night exhales, and history, sleepy, smiling, finally closes its eyes.